This book is part of a series of books which I've produced in a multitude of different languages on economics, on the market economy, on the questions of the welfare state, fundamentals of liberty, and then war and peace and the relationship to the ideas of liberty. What's intended for these is to be snack boxes. It's a series of essays. You don't have to start at the beginning and read through to the end. It's intended to be something that would be useful. Read what you like, and if you don't find the other essays interesting or engaging, that's okay. So it's not a giant meal. It's a series of intellectual snacks, and the idea is to get some ideas that might be useful to you, not to convince you necessarily of everything I believe, but to be stimulating and to encourage you to do your own thinking. One of the reasons I delved into this question was thinking about not only the supply of state power and authoritarianism. There's people willing to supply dictatorship, all the people who want to be dictators, but also the demand for it. So there's a supply side, but also a demand side to authoritarianism. State control is supplied because some people like to exercise power over others, but also it's demanded by some people. People think that they can't make decisions for themselves. They want a strong hand, to use this slogan from Russia, the strong hand of the Tsar, now President Putin. Of course, some may believe, well, I can make decisions, but other people can't make decisions about their own lives. And so there's this demand side, and I wanted to address that as well. So you think about a normal supply and demand curve. We find that there's a quantity that will be supplied at a certain price of goods. Well, we try to restrain the supply of power through constitutional limitations on power, through checks and balances. So this is a long experience of constitutionalism. Poland has a great history in this regard. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Republic of Nobles, was a very important chapter in this experience of constitutionalism, and many others in European history as well. Montesquieu, of course, being one of the primary theorists of this. Well, if we think about a constitutional constraint on power, think about bills of rights and constitutions, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech, and so on. That can reduce the quantity of power, but with somewhat limited success. There's always pushing outward, trying to overcome those. And so I thought, well, it's important also if you can move the demand curve in as well. You might end up with less power being seized and exercised over other people. So that's part of what motivated the book, was to think about how can we affect the demand for coercion and the demand for unlimited power, not just the supply. Now, there's a very deep relationship between freedom on the one hand and responsibility. And that's a theme that I weave through the book. These are very intimately connected. When you think about freedom, though, a lot of people think of being irresponsible, of partying all the time. That's what it means to be free. To be free is to have no constraints on what you do whatever comes into your mind, don't think about tomorrow, no commitments, and so on. Having a dissipated life, being selfish, lawless, and generally being out of control. Now, that's a common understanding of freedom. I recently lectured at a program, and most of the students were from China. And one of the very intelligent students came up to me and she said, "You have talked about the importance of discussion in government." I said, "Yes, that's right. Parliament means where we talk about things." But she said, "Discussion leads to disagreement. Disagreement leads to discord. Discord leads to violence, revolution, and killing. Therefore, let's not have any discussion." And I said, well, that's what the Communist Party tells you, of course. That's the mentality of the Communist Party. But think about it. We're discussing right now. We're discussing the idea of discussion. You can't get away from it using your mind. But in the Communist Party view, if people have freedom, it will mean chaos, disorder, and destruction. But then when you think about responsibility, unfortunately, people think about boring old people lecturing you on how you should behave. They think it's dull. A responsible life is tedious and boring. I think it's a big mistake. In fact, freedom and responsibility are very intimately entwined. You can't have one without the other, certainly not for very long. And here I'll just cite a very important intellectual figure who explored these issues, Professor Hayek. Liberty not only means that the individual has both the opportunity and the burden of choice, it also means he must bear the consequences of his actions and will receive praise or blame for them. Liberty and responsibility are inseparable. And I'll return to this concept of praise and blame, which plays a very important part in the book and the chapters. So the history of liberty is the history of responsibility and freedom. We're moral agents because we can be held responsible for our behavior. We're not just subjects or things to be controlled by others, moved about like pieces on a chessboard. As Adam Smith said in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, that the man of system thinks of society like a chessboard, but he never understands that each chess piece has a principle of motion of its own. This does not enter into their view. But we should recognize everybody has a principle of motion of his own or her own. This is extremely important in the development of liberalism, or the idea of the free society. And I cite here Francisco de Vitoria, one of the very, very important figures in the school of Salamanca. He wrote a book in defense of the Indians, De Indis. The Spanish Empire that had invaded had enslaved the Indians, treated with extraordinary brutality and cruelty. And these Spanish churchmen stood up and said, this is simply wrong. It's a crime. Bartolomé de las Casas, a very important one, Francisco Marroquín, and Francisco de Vitoria. And de Vitoria's book on the Indians is an exploration of human agency. As he says, a person is master of his own actions insofar as he's able to make choices between one course and another. And the Indians are not, in point of fact, madmen. They have judgment like other men. They have cities, marriages, magistrates, laws, industries, and commerce, all of which require the use of freedom. They're moral agents, and it was a vicious sin to use violence against them, to conquer and enslave them. This led to a great debate within Spain and within the church about the moral status of non-European peoples. That argument was advanced in England by the group known as the Levelers, kind of proto-liberals, early liberal thinkers. Richard Overton, a very important figure, when he was in prison, wrote a powerful essay that had a great influence for centuries to come. To every individual in nature is given an individual property by nature, not to be invaded or usurped by any. For everyone as he is himself, so he has a self-propriety, else could he not be himself. In other words, just to have the identity of being a person, you had to have freedom. You had to have the right to manage your own life. Connected to that in law and morality is the idea of the presumption of liberty. This is a deeply important idea that's foundational to the free society, but very often misunderstood. The presumption of liberty says we presume you have the liberty, but it doesn't mean an absolute liberty. You could argue against it. There might be reasons to defeat it. And I contrast the presumption of liberty with the presumption of power. So we'll take a very simple case. Under the presumption of liberty, you're presumed free to do what you want, unless there's a reason not to. The presumption of power says the state gets to tell you you can't do it, and you cannot do it unless you get permission, a license of some sort from the state. So imagine you want to bake a cake for your daughter's birthday party. That's a common thing that people would do. Now, under the presumption of power, you have to get a permission. You go to the Ministry of Baking, and you say, I want a permit to bake a birthday cake. Oh, it's a birthday cake, that's on floor 3. So you go to floor 3, they say, is it a boy or a girl? Oh, it's for my daughter. That's room 12. Oh, they're closed today. Come back later. Maybe you can get a permit then. But you may not bake the cake unless you get a permit. The presumption of liberty, on the other hand, says, just bake the cake. You don't need anyone's permission to bake a cake. Mix in the ingredients, prepare the cake, and surprise your daughter for her birthday. But it is a defeasible presumption. It means you can show a reason why it should be overcome. Imagine that your oven will generate sparks that will burn down the neighbor's house and destroy everything. That would be a very good reason to tell you you may not bake a cake because it will have a negative impact on others. But to stop you from exercising it, I have to give the reason why you should be stopped. In criminal laws, we were discussing criminal law earlier, there's a presumption of innocence. You do not have to prove you're innocent. The prosecutor must prove you're guilty. And it's the same principle for the presumption of liberty. You don't have to prove you should be free. They have to prove why you should be restricted. And I'll give one more example. In the state of Colorado, in the summer, you're not allowed to shoot fireworks. You think, well, why should you be stopped from shooting fireworks? The reason is, it's very easy to light all the forests on fire and burn down thousands of other people's homes because it's very dry in the mountains. So, in the summer months, they say, no fireworks. And that's reasonable because it would endanger all the other people. In the winter, you can shoot off fireworks if you want to because it's wet and there's a lot of snow around, but not in the summer. But you don't have to go and show why you should be able to do things. But when there's a reason to stop you, you can legitimately restrict that. Now, when you think about it, we should not presume to that we have to get permission, as Joseph Eötvös put it, for objectives of their own choice. He was a great Hungarian liberal. He was the man responsible for the liberation of the Jews in Hungary, who campaigned for equal rights for Jewish Hungarians, and a really profound and important theorist of liberalism in the 19th century. Wrote a series of quite significant books that unfortunately are probably not in Polish, but someday they should be. He said, liberty is a state in which people can use both their own abilities and the natural forces in their environment to achieve objectives of their own choice, not the objectives of the ruler or the state or the king or the commissar, but your own purposes and your own objectives, not those that are dictated to us collectively. Hayek, in the similar tradition, he talked about the liberty of the unknown person. So for Eötvös, it's the person with their own objectives, and Hayek says not just the ones we know, but the unknown person. What is important is not what freedom I personally would like to exercise, but what freedom some person may need in order to do things beneficial to society. This freedom we can assure to the unknown person only by giving it to all. The unknown person, that innovator that you would never expect to introduce a new idea, a new product, something that will revolutionize the world like containerized shipping, or a new kind of delivery of goods and services like Amazon pioneered. And this is for those unknown people, often humble people, people who aren't famous, they don't have fancy degrees, they don't come from wealthy families, but they introduce the things that change the world. Now, moving forward a little bit, Hayek also, in his very important essay, on the use of knowledge of society, pointed out, this is why his critique of socialism was so powerful. He says the knowledge is not given to anyone in its totality. The knowledge relevant to social coordination and improvement is scattered in a whole society among people who are not known to us, who have information unique to them that cannot be put into a government report to guide the Ministry of Planning. It can only be actualized in the market economy by people buying and selling and using the price system. And just to conclude with Hayek, he said this is how you get a general order of society, a form of social coordination, an overall order so we do not interfere with each other. And he says that is what the market economy, that is what individual liberty produce, is an overall order, but the details were not predictable in advance. We can never predict exactly what society is going to look like in the future, a free society. Every potential dictator can tell you how society will be in 10 years. But honest people say, we have no clue. We might say some general things, but there will be an order that none of us could predict that will emerge through innovation and new ways of doing things. Now, let's go back to this issue of fundamentally freedom. Quite often people have portrayed freedom as atomistic, isolated, and therefore advocates of freedom don't believe in society. They think it's a condition of isolation and so on. That's a deep misunderstanding. To be a free person is to live in a free society, not to go off all alone on an island. I'm not interested personally in that kind of freedom. I want to live with other people. And to live as a free person in society means we live in a free society. And that's something that's been very well appreciated in Poland. One of the things I really deeply appreciate about the Polish nation and the story of the struggle for freedom in Poland is that your freedom and my freedom are not viewed as rivalrous or as enemies, but as complementary. And that was articulated so brilliantly in the Polish uprising, Warsaw. We fight in the name of God for our freedom and yours. This, I think, is one of the most beautiful elements of the Polish history, was not to hate the enemy, but to say we're fighting for our freedom and your freedom as well. And this also we saw when Poles went to fight for the independence of the American colonies. They did it because they believed in the freedom of everyone. Poles who fought in the Royal Air Force in the Second World War, those pilots were able to escape the Nazi and Soviet invasion and went to fly with Britain, put that on the tails of their airplanes. This, I think, is one of the most powerful elements in Polish history, and now being realized again as Poles have been so supportive of Ukrainian neighbors. Even though we all understand there has been a lot of terrible history between Poles and Ukrainians in the past, this is in the past. And now to live together as free people, it's been so powerful to see Poles standing up for the freedom of their neighbors as part of their heritage. But liberty and responsibility are not related as opposites or as things that are trade-offs. Responsibility is the reward we get for being free people. It's not the price we pay, it's the reward. Because it's the ability to say, I did this, I achieved this. My life is my own product. And to be proud of the things that you achieve in life. That is the reward of freedom. Aristotle put it very neatly that a truly moral life is only possible when people have freedom and responsibility. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he discusses at some length praise and blame are dependent on whether the people in question are compelled or not to act as they do. A person who is compelled to do something cannot be blamed for it or praised for it when it's compelled. But a free action can be, on the one hand, blamed if it's a terrible bad thing, or praised if it was noble and good. One of the figures who articulated this so clearly, the great American figure Frederick Douglass, part of the second founding of the American Republic, really a significant figure. I highly recommend reading his autobiography. He was so good at it, he wrote 2 autobiographies. Both of them are very good. And he talked about the condition of slavery, stripped of every right, denied every privilege, could not even say myself. The slave was forbidden to say myself because everything belonged to another person. This person had been stripped of moral agency. And I have a lengthy quote in the book of his description of what the slave masters would do to poison the idea of freedom among slaves. They would encourage them to drunkenness. They would have a day that would say, you can drink all you want, and then the masters would take bets who could drink the most before dropping down from being drunk among the slaves. And the idea was to say, this is your day of freedom. What is freedom? It just means getting drunk and throwing up. And Douglass said after this experience, people would go back, after this holiday from slavery was over, this drunkenness, back to the fields almost relieved that they were not going to be throwing up and vomiting and drunk all the time. He said that was their conception of freedom, and it poisoned the minds of the slaves against their own liberty. He said instead, freedom was to take responsibility for leading the best life you can lead, that was the exercise of freedom and responsibility. Now, some also say, well, self-control means everybody's rational all the time. That's simply false. And Hayek addressed this very neatly in a very important essay, Individualism, True and False. He said, we don't believe that people are highly rational, intelligent. Individualism rests on the idea that we're actually fallible. All of us make mistakes. We all have terrible temptations in our lives. But our errors are corrected in a process of social interaction that will generate a better outcome. Not that one person has some godlike characteristics, that's individualism, but that all of us are fallible. This is the deeply individualist notion, and the responsibility is assigned not in order to say that he was he might have acted differently, but in order to make him act differently. When people are responsible, they bear the consequences of their acts, and it yields better outcomes. In effect, when we are responsible, we become better people. And I think this is one of the key elements of the free society. Loss of responsibility means also a loss of freedom. One of the chapters by Lisa Conyers is based on very extensive case studies in the welfare state in the United States. And the U.S. welfare state has had very terrible consequences for large elements of the American population who get trapped into welfare dependency. And she points out how difficult it is to escape that, to get out of welfare dependency. And those people who manage to do it deserve great credit and admiration. I'll give you just a personal example. I don't put it in the book from my own life. I had 2 brothers, and one of them had alcoholism, very terrible alcohol dependency, and it really was horrible for him. My other brother and I rescued him a few times, and when we got him to hospital once, the social worker said he should get into a rehabilitation program. How do we do that? She was very helpful. I learned to appreciate social workers much more. She said, you have to go register at the county welfare office first. So why? Well, it's a requirement under the law of the state of Washington. Okay, so my brother and I made a list of all of his assets. We had a truck, we sold the truck, we got the cash, and we had all of his assets that we could accumulate. And then we went to the welfare office with a list of all the money we had from our brother, what he had. And the welfare officer said, that's terrible. Get rid of that money. Go spend it. Have a party. It's too much money. Make sure you get down to almost no money and then come back, and he'll become my client. And I'll deal with his problems. And my other brother was with me. He just about reached across to strangle this man, because what he wanted was for our brother to become his client and perpetually dependent on him. And Lisa Conyers explains how that system works to make sure that any advantage you get in life will be harmful to you, so you don't have any reason to get a raise or a better job and so on, because you'll lose benefits. The welfare state, when it takes responsibility for our well-being, also tends to undermine social trust. And there's a series of studies by Nima Sanandaji in Sweden that have documented this rather effectively, that as the welfare benefits rose, what he calls welfare and benefit morale and tax morale fell. The numbers of people saying it's okay to accept benefits for which you do not qualify went up, and the willingness to cheat on taxes. A common thesis is, so welfare states produce social trust. Look at Scandinavia. He documented very effectively that's not true. For a welfare state to persist, you need to start with social trust, which the Scandinavian and Nordic countries had already. But the extension of the welfare state will erode that social trust. So he looks at the percentage of people in the World Values Survey agreed that claiming government benefits to which you are not entitled is never justified. And that number fell, reaching 55%. However, in the most recent study, 2022, after the Scandinavian countries and Sweden in particular made workfare, so it's a little bit more difficult to get benefits, and reduced the tax burden, social norms began to recover. This is a positive news. But we find that when you remove responsibility from people, it erodes norms, social trust, and morality. Finally, and I'll conclude with a few notes on this, some people assume when they think about self-control that we're just the way many economists portray the human being, a utility machine. We just calculate utility, that's it. In fact, that's not a very good description of human behavior. We know a lot more about how the human personality works. Even Plato, I'm not a big fan of Plato in general, but he had some deep insights into what he called the appetitive part of the human soul versus the rational part, and the contestation between them, as did Aristotle. What we found is with modern neuroscience that there is a battle, as Steven Pinker at Harvard University puts it, between parts of the mind that are at war. And to become self-controlled is to learn how to master your own self, in effect, how to control your own brain. So a wonderful book by the Dutch physiologist Dick Swab, who looked at the way in which different parts of the brain are actuated. There's a fundamental principle. Everyone was taught this by their parents. It was a deep kind of folk psychology. When you become very angry, stop and take a breath before you say anything. Not only does it give you a moment to reflect, it oxygenates the prefrontal cortex of the brain. This is the portion of the brain that thinks about consequences. So if you're angry and you hit someone in the nose, bad things are going to happen. That's why your mother and father probably told you, stop, take a deep breath, and then think, oh, if I hit that person in the face, he might hit me back. Or it might be a policeman. That would be very terrible. I'd go to prison. So by taking a deep breath, we activate those portions of our brain that think about consequences, and we achieve more self-control. Well, there are many ways in which we can achieve more self-control. That's a simple one that parents teach their children. But there are lots of others, and the book has several chapters on how to achieve greater self-control. It doesn't mean becoming a robot or calculating figure. It's about becoming mindful of what we want to achieve in life, about thinking about the long-term consequences, being aware of people around us. And those are all things we can all become better at. We teach it to children, but some people think that's when it stops. In my opinion, it's a lifelong learning experience. I try to become more self-controlled. I don't always succeed. Sometimes I become really angry when I shouldn't. But I try to learn techniques to control myself. So it's a life project, not something that ends at 16 or 18 or something like that, but how to achieve self-control. One of the books I recommend on this question is a really powerful book by Kelly McGonigal from Stanford University. A very simple example. If you have a bad habit that you'd like to break, something you think is harmful to yourself, just stopping it is very hard to do. Much more effective is to substitute another habit for it so that you effectuate that ingrained pattern of habitual behavior, but instead of the thing you don't want to do, like eating too much food or drinking alcohol or whatever it might happen to be, you substitute something else for that. So you can more easily substitute one habit for another than to eliminate the bad habit. That's the hardest thing to do. Try instead to substitute another habit for it. So there are a few chapters on that. Some people argue there's a horrible expression in English, rugged individualism. I actually hate that term. We have a very rugged gentleman here. It suggests that only manly men like him can be individualists. Women couldn't be individualists. This is nonsense. Individualism is about self-control. You don't have to be like a rancher to be that way. You could be very feminine. You could be dainty. You could be all sorts of things and still show self-control in your life. Be in charge of your own future and achieve the interests that you want. This is a deep part of a free society, as the sociologist Norbert Elias demonstrated in his work. A very powerful writer. He pointed out that the internalization of these forms of self-control was what made free societies possible. He was very interested in the decline in violence over time and things of norms like, for example, don't point at people at the dinner table with your knife. This used to be very common in the Middle Ages, and it led to lots of fights. People said, that's very rude. Don't do that. And this etiquette, we call it, was internalized. So even children today show more civilized behavior than adults from previous centuries because we internalize the controls. We don't need a policeman to bring us about to do it. And it's that internalization of control that makes possible an extended social order. Hayek again talked about the rule of law and how that was such an important element, the willingness to follow general rules rather than impulse. This is being tested very much in the United States, where we have a president-elect who's very impulsive, and he thinks rules don't apply to him. And we need to train him to say, no, the rules apply to everyone. It's not just about impulse. The rule of law is what is supreme. And then, just to conclude, going back to another great economist, Nobel laureate, James Buchanan, what is the case for liberty? Is it just the traditional utilitarian case, we'll get more stuff, we'll have more material well-being? He says, no, man does not want liberty in order to maximize his utility or that of the society of which he is a part. He wants liberty to become the man he wants to become. And obviously, this is not limited only to males. It's just the English language has this gendered element. It's for the person to become the person she wants to become or he wants to become. That's the most important case for liberty, not that we just get more stuff. Aristotle focused on the way in which we become better. By doing just things, we become just. Moderate things, we become moderate. And courageous things makes us courageous. We need the freedom to do those things to become better people, to become the people we want to be. So that's what the book is about. It's a combination of political theory, moral theory, social theory, and self-help book with chapters on techniques we can use to try to achieve greater control in our life. And I'll conclude, there's a bonus. Another book that I've written is available in Polish, and you can download from this QR code a zero-price copy. I'm enough of an economist. I never say it's free. It's just the price is zero. A book on development economics from the perspective of dignity. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm interested in learning more from a Polish perspective about freedom.
Okay, thank you, Tom, really for this introduction to your book and many insightful thoughts, and also that you related to our history. That's wonderful that we may show that in Polish history we also have liberty traditions. Since we have a lot of people in the rooms, I will ask if there are any questions from audience we want to ask Tom. Any questions? Okay. Sorry? Okay. So, maybe Tom, we will be... I have one question, because we are living in times of big change. I mean, the changes in the balance of power, how the world is shaped. It looks much different than, let's say, 30 years ago, when the world was changing, the Iron Curtain collapsed, and there were different outcomes for liberty in different questions. We had a chance to talk about this before our meeting, so I think this is an excellent opportunity to expand this topic. So, for example, I know the topic is broad. For example, in Poland, in Czechia, we have the different outcome of liberty. Our countries are now, after 30 years, much more developed. We are living no worse than in Western Europe, but the exam for liberty didn't have the same outcome, for example, let's say in Russia. Also, in Ukraine during 90s years, 2000, also Russia took advantage of this, let's say, anarchy and monopolizing different sectors of economy. So does the culture of this, does the culture matters? So let's put it simple. Does it matter, the culture, how people are behaved? You related to Sweden, where you have very high societal trust. Is it like the society needs first to develop this self-restraint, or rather this confidence in themselves, this trust, and then it should move to liberty, or is it another way around?
Yeah, I don't think there's a stage thing. First you develop character and then you get freedom. One of the reasons is that freedom is developed, as character is developed through freedom. That's a very important part. It's the exercise of freedom by which we develop our character. And that's one of the things that Aristotle emphasizes in his Ethics. And I think it's a deep insight. If we look at Russia, I think that one of the reasons why Russia has become a nightmare, totalitarian nightmare, today, and by the way, just every day there's no more scary news out of Russia. It's become a society of informers, people informing on their pupils in school that they drew a painting, a picture that said peace on it, and so they call the police who arrest the parents. It's just become a terrible, awful place. The historical trajectory had a role to play in this. They did not have independent groups between the common person and the Tsar. This was a legacy of the Mongol conquest. The Russian state propaganda says that they're inheritors of Kiev and Rus. This is nonsense. This is the outcome of the Mongol conquest. This is the foundation of the Russian state. And because when the clan of the White Bone was left behind after the poisoning of Ogadai Khan in 1241, and the armies left to go back to Karakoram to elect a new Khan, but the clan of the White Bone, as among the Mongols, was remaining in Russia, and the Prince of Muscovy became their tax collector. And the consequence was no reciprocity between anyone in the population and the Prince of Muscovy. If you didn't pay your taxes, you just got wiped out. No negotiation, unlike what happened in Poland, unlike what happened even in Ukraine, where they had the Cossacks as free communities, and in the rest of Europe. So the history was one of total submission to the Tsar. Also, the state controlled the church, unlike what happened in the West, where with the Gregorian Reformation, the church asserts its independence of the empire. There's a struggle between the two, and with the Concordat of Worms, you get this identification of two realms that interpenetrate each other, the spiritual and the secular or temporal. This does not happen in Russia, and the Orthodox Church within Russia became subject to the power of the Tsar. And finally, the brief experiences of constitutionalism in Russia were snuffed out. So we think about one of the most horrible moments in Russian history is the assassination of Alexander II on his way to sign a new constitution, which would have been the introduction of something like a constitutional monarchy to Russia, and he was killed. And then his successors said, we're not doing that again. So that was snuffed out. 1905, after the military defeat, they have a flourishing of an elected Duma and quite dramatic advance. And then World War I wipes all of that out, and the Bolshevik coup d'etat, the so-called Bolshevik Revolution, which was actually just a coup. The revolution had already taken place under Kerensky and the more democratic forces. And they reassert this horrible principle. Then collapse of the Soviet Union. You do have a period of democratic opening, and Putin closes that up and is able to destroy it when oil prices went up. So he said, I don't need to have rule of law. I have oil. I can do whatever I want. This, I think, helps to explain Russia's terrible and sad state. But it does not suggest that somehow it's inevitable, that it could not have been otherwise. There were very brave people who fought for these principles in Russia. They're dead, or they are in exile or in prison right now. So I don't believe in the essentialism that says somehow Russia could never be free. Some people argue this. I don't think that. But I think that their historical experience makes it much harder challenge. And in a way, those Russians who have stood up against us, like the people from Memorial, for example, who've been imprisoned in Russia, I really admire the courage of those people within that hostile environment to stand up against it. Effectively, they're being snuffed out. So culture matters. I fear sometimes culture is the term that people use for all the things they can't explain. Oh, it's culture that explains the difference. And I think we should delve down into the history of these particular cases to understand them. Lastly, when we think about a country such as China, this is one of the most interesting cases. You used to hear it said quite frequently, and Samuel Huntington argued this, and he was not alone, that they don't get freedom. They can't understand freedom. Look at it. It's a communist society. Well, the Chinese liberals I know, a very powerful, important intellectuals, said, you know, when you look on the wall of all the government buildings in China, what do you see? Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao. The first four are not Chinese. And one of my friends put it very neatly. His name is Feng Xingyuan. He said, in the history of China, many ideas have been proposed, and some very foolish, but no one was ever stupid enough in Chinese history to propose communism. For this, we rely on Germans and Russians, who brought us communism. So this was a European idea that has done terribly in China, and China has its own tradition of the ideas of freedom and responsibility within the Taoist and the Confucian traditions.
Okay, so thank you, Tom, for this. Yeah.
Thank you. I think you made a very powerful argument on linking freedom and responsibility. Responsibility, though, it's also knowing what's good or bad. Something you mentioned, Aristotle, he made a also powerful argument of what's good or bad, and those means rules also, means in different forms, religion, political system. And then you get a lot of progressive arguments that all those rules, religions, values were just developed to control people not smart enough to recognize and just to subdue them, to make them less powerful and just obey the few who had no rules at all. How you answer this argument? Quite often this appears in the rhetorics of progressives.
There's an arrogance that's embedded in that, which is unfortunately widespread, that so-called ordinary people or people who didn't go to college don't know how to run their own lives. And they look down on such people, and I think it's a terrible mistake. Years ago, I had the experience of having a very educated person say things that were a bit mocking about my family. So I was the first person in my family to go to university. And said, oh, this is so sad, those people, they didn't know how to run their lives. I said, I think my parents did pretty well. They were probably better educated than average college graduates today anyway, because they read books on their own. They didn't have the opportunity to get fancy college degrees and so on, but they led good lives of dignity. And it's too often that people think that only going to school and getting a degree is what makes you a moral agent, as if other people can't have that. So this arrogance is embedded in this mentality, the so-called progressivism. The second thing is that they deny human agency. It's a very important point. The deep understanding of this mentality is that there's no acting agent. There's only the intersection of forces, social forces, class conflict, racial domination, gender domination, and so on. That's what's real. And you, this material individual, are what is called epiphenomenal. What's real are these forces, and you are merely the intersection of them. This comes out through Marxism also. It's a very deep denial of the personal agency of the individual human being. And therefore, it's quite natural that when they punish you or kill you, nothing was lost. The Marxists were very clear about this in the Soviet Union. They could kill off tens of thousands of people, and there was no real loss. Because what exists is the species being, and the individual instantiation is unimportant. And I think this is absolutely wrong. It turns the world upside down. What matters are the flesh and blood people we interact with. Talk about social forces. Those are abstractions we use to explain the reality of our lives. They're not more real than we are. They're merely concepts. But for this progressive mentality, they think those are what are real. And you are epiphenomenal. Your agency doesn't matter. And this is at a deep metaphysical level. I think they turned the world upside down.
Okay, thank you for the answer. I'm glad that I managed to break the ice, and we have two more questions. So, sir?
Thank you very much. Good evening. Zbigniew Lasocik, Uniwersytet Warszawski, University of Warsaw. My question is naive or maybe even stupid, but before that I will inform you that I asked my students at the first class what value they like, what is their system of values, and freedom never comes first. Never. For the last 12 years or 10 years. So my question is, why to write on freedom in 21st century? Because it's forgotten, or maybe is old-fashioned, or maybe is changing so quickly that we need to define it and again. What would be your diagnosis of the situation? Thank you.
I couldn't say very much about Polish society in particular because I lack the knowledge that you have. But we have seen a lack of appreciation among younger people in particular, not only of freedom but of democracy, which I find very disturbing. So increasing percentages, even approaching majorities in a number of countries, say they're indifferent between democracy and dictatorship. And I find that also quite chilling, that they don't seem to quite understand what a dictatorship will mean, to be subject to the arbitrary power of a ruler, a dictator, a party, whatever it happens to be. There's a kind of collective amnesia emerging. In a number of post-communist countries, this has a somewhat different characteristic, because they hear their grandparents or great-grandparents sometimes saying, oh, life under that time was pretty good. And they're confusing two features. One was the party state and the dictatorship. The other was being young. And when you get older, you remember being young fondly. It's when you had your friends and you fell in love and all these good things happen. And that gets confused with communism. So young people who had zero experience of communism hear from old people some positive stories, and I got my job, and I got my paycheck, and life was good, and we had beer and sausages with our friends. And then they say, oh, that must be pretty good. And I am afraid that in a number of countries, this is a very serious issue that's going to require people to explain what it meant to be afraid, what it meant to fear the knock on the door late at night, what it meant not to be told you couldn't enter a certain profession, because, like in communist East Germany, people would be allocated to labor positions. You didn't get to choose what you wanted to do. What that meant. And also the corruption that involved, the party members who got special favors not available to the rest of the society and so on. They don't have any idea about that. So I think it's part of our responsibility to remind people with vivid stories about what dictatorship really means. It seems so much better than all this parliamentary discussion and debate and checks and balances and nothing gets done and so on. I'll mention Hayek again, not because I'm sort of a groupie, but I always find his book so challenging. He really, when I've read them, he makes me think. And in The Road to Serfdom, he said, it's when people dismiss discussion in favor of action that a dictatorship is being prepared. And I'm afraid this is also something we're hearing now. The attack on checks and balances and parliamentary debate as somehow a waste of time. Viktor Orban is a good example of this. He's a two-bit petty dictator from nearby Hungary who cemented his power into a one-party state. And he said, we don't need any more parliamentary discussion. He never debated Peter Markarze, the leader of the opposition. Not one debate before the general election. The opposition had 5 minutes on television in the 6 months before the election, whereas Orban had 24 hours a day on state media. And he said, no more need for debate. We know what needs to be done. It's like when a log falls in front of the road, we don't debate it. You get 30 strong young men and move the log. That is the mentality that leads to dictatorship. And unfortunately, it's very attractive to many people. So I'm not totally sanguine about the future. I'm worried about it. When people view liberty as not so important and dictatorship as at least as good as the democracy, it means to me I need to work harder for these principles and values, not to throw up my hand and say, oh my God, young people are stupid or something. I don't believe that. I need to do a better job of convincing people of the values of liberal democracy.
Okay, so we have one more question to conclude our meeting. I pass the microphone.
Thank you. Good evening. You already mentioned welfare state, and during the question session a bit later, the intellectuals or the academics looking down on so-called ordinary people from their ivory towers. And I would like to ask you about one of such ideas lately by Mr. Thomas Piketty, with his over 1,000 pages work on the modern capital. Of course, to me they basically the same, but the idea, the summarized idea that the returns on capital grows faster than the returns on labor, which inevitably leads us to inequalities. And it leads me to my question. So, do you think what's your opinion on this? Is there anything between the free market in its pure form, say the dream of Mr. Millet, and the welfare state? That's and the second, probably more important thing is, should we consider it, and is it something that as a libertarian, as somebody who appreciates freedom should consider, and we should, what would be the, let's say, the dogma here?
I'm not a fan of dogma, so that's not a term I would want to use. But thinking about application of principles. First point on Piketty, I think was a terrible book. I actually read the whole thing and managed to avoid killing myself because it was a very boring book. But it was so full of holes, so I participated in an academic book that came out. I wrote the foreword to it about the book, and he retracted the entire thesis about a year and a half after the English edition came out in the American Economic Review. So his thesis that R is greater than G, the return on capital is greater than the general growth, which will lead to inevitable accumulations of inequality. He admitted, well, that's just not true. And he pulled the entire thesis in this article in the American Economic Review, and I'd be happy to share it with you. So it was a kind of a disappointment, given what an exciting thesis it was, to find out, oh, I didn't really mean it. It only explained a small period of time. That's much less interesting. Inequality is not something that bothers me as much as poverty does. So one way to put it, people die from poverty all the time, but I've never known anyone who died from inequality. So you might have much more money than I do, or a bigger car, or a nicer house. There's not a harm to me. Having not enough food to survive or medical care is a problem for me, and that's what I'm concerned about, and not inequality per se. We have seen the trend, two interesting trends, one of which he never addresses. Global inequality by every measure has declined, decade on decade, since about 1960. So, and why is that? It's because poor countries are becoming wealthier at a rapid rate. And it's partly because things like vaccines and medical care are fairly easily transferable from one country to another. So life expectancy has grown dramatically throughout the world. And he doesn't address that. I think that's a more interesting kind of inequality, and globally it's been falling dramatically. Within countries, there are three measures of inequality, and he doesn't address all of them. There's wealth inequality, income inequality, and consumption inequality. Consumption inequality, I think, is the one that really matters. That's the interesting one. So you might have more wealth than I have, but it doesn't mean you have buckets of gold coins. It means you own shares in companies, typically, that are producing value. But his view of wealth is it's just a big bag of money, which is, I think, very primitive. Steve Jobs doesn't have a giant bag of money. He owns a huge share of Amazon, and that is producing wealth as we go on. And the more he saves, the better off I am, because it's producing more additional wealth in the world. But consumption inequality, which he never addresses, has been falling. So consider, for example, Bill Gates, one of the richest people in the world, and the dental care that he gets compared to the dental care of a lower income person. They're not that different. In contrast to the difference 50 years ago was huge. But moreover, no one today, not even a very low income person, would want the dental care available to the richest people in the world 20 years ago. So I remember visits to the dentist. They were much worse in the past than they are now. Now we have pain-free dentistry. They are able, I had a filling done, and they put this thing in and they shine light on it and it's finished. As opposed to all the drilling they used to do, that's all gone. So that the quality of the dental care the poor can afford, even in Thailand where I spent part of my time, poor people can afford better dental care than a billionaire could have gotten 20 years ago. To me, that's more interesting. And he never addresses that. That's the inequality I'm interested in changing, and not whether there's a change in the Gini coefficient within a country, which I think is much less interesting. So I'm not as moved by that tradition. Now, the last point, to finish it up, I'm not opposed to income transfers per se. I don't have a absolute never mentality on those things. But we should always remember they have to be within the context of the rule of law. And they're very dangerous because they can expand and be expanded by those who know how to manipulate them. So there are lots of welfare transfers that go to wealthy people. This should not surprise us. Rich people are usually better at manipulating bureaucratic systems than poor people. That's one of the reasons they're rich. They're more clever at that sort of thing. And so a lot of welfare state policies that are advocated as helping the poor actually are churning within the middle class, or they end up being upward transfers from the poor to the rich. Farm price supports are a good example in Europe and the United States, Canada, and Japan. Farm price supports are justified as helping poor farmers. They're huge transfers to rich farmers. And we should be very aware of those things. So in principle, I don't rule them out as impossible, but I'm very skeptical about them, and I think we should always examine them with great care. Thank you so much.
Tom. Yeah, thank you that you answered so brilliantly these questions. So that concludes our today's meeting. If you wish to speak to Tom, now would be an excellent opportunity also to get a signature to your book. That was Evening with WEI Publishing House. Thank you for attending our event, and see you again.